He had chosen the worst possible place to attack her. A courtroom filled with fluorescent light, polished wood, and the kind of silence that made every cough sound like a verdict. David stood at the counsel table with that familiar expression, half pity, half arrogance, as if the last 7 years had only taught him how to smile harder. Emma sat across from him, her hands folded over a navy folder, her face composed in a way that made the room underestimate her. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. And if you believe dignity is the strongest revenge, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to her story. The legal battle had started with one cruel assumption, that she would be too emotional to stand up for herself. Too soft, too tired, too alone. But Emma had learned long ago that survival had a sound of its own, and it was quiet. It looked like arriving early. It looked like reading every line twice. It looked like a woman who no longer asked permission to protect her life. David smoothed his tie and leaned back, glancing at the judge as though the outcome had already been decided. He had spent months building a story around her, telling anyone who would listen that she was unstable, difficult, impossible to reason with. In the hallway outside, his attorney had even laughed about how easy this would be. But Emma knew something they didn't. She had spent the last 3 nights at her kitchen table under a single lamp, surrounded by highlighted pages, bank statements, time-stamped emails, and printed messages lined up with surgical precision. Not anger, not panic, just proof. The kind that waits patiently until the exact second it is needed. Across the aisle, David glanced at her again, expecting a flinch, maybe even tears. Instead, she opened the navy folder and set 3 clean stacks of paper on the table, each marked with a blue tab. Neat, quiet, final. The room changed almost immediately. A few heads turned. A clerk paused mid-breath. David's smile thinned, then vanished. Emma did not look at him when she spoke. She looked straight ahead, her voice calm enough to make the words heavier. I'm ready to proceed. It was such a small sentence, and yet it landed like a locked door. David shifted in his seat, suddenly aware that this was no longer the version of the story he had rehearsed. Emma had not come here to plead. She had come here prepared. 7 mistakes. That was what she had named them in her notes. One for each way he had tried to shrink her into silence. Mistake 1 was thinking she would arrive unarmed. Mistake 2 was believing he still knew how to frighten her. Mistake 3 was forgetting that the woman he called easy to manage had already survived being underestimated once before. The judge adjusted his glasses. The air in the room tightened. And as Emma placed her fingertip on the first tab, David finally understood that this was not the beginning of his victory. It was the beginning of his reckoning. By the time the hearing recessed, the courtroom had settled into a thin, watchful hush, the kind that lingered after a storm had passed without rain. Emma gathered her navy folder with the same steady hands that had once learned to steady a home that was no longer hers to protect. David was already speaking to his attorney in a low, irritated murmur, but his voice kept breaking against the silence she left behind. She walked out into the corridor beneath rows of fluorescent lights that flattened every shadow and made the world feel unforgivingly honest. Then, only when the heavy door closed behind her, did her shoulders ease by a fraction. Not from defeat, from release. In the hallway, the air smelled of polished stone, printer toner, and old coffee cooling in paper cups on a metal cart. Emma paused by a window that overlooked the courthouse steps and let herself breathe. One breath, then another. The city moved below in blunt, ordinary rhythm, buses hissing at the curb, pedestrians crossing with coats tucked close against the wind. It struck her then, quietly and without drama, how long she had lived as if every day depended on surviving David's mood, his sarcasm, his need to be the tallest voice in the room. That life had made her small in ways no mirror could show. But this morning, standing alone with her files and her composure, she felt the first clean edge of something new. Not triumph. Not yet. Just room. Room to think without flinching. Room to choose without apologizing. Her phone vibrated once in her hand. A message from her legal assistant. The next filing had been received, and every exhibit was in order. Emma read it twice, then slid the phone back into her coat pocket. There had been a time when even a simple message like that would have made her cry from relief. Now it only anchored her. She thought of the list she had made at her kitchen table weeks ago, the 7 mistakes, the 7 places where she had once allowed fear to pass for peace. The list had not been written out of revenge. It had been written like a map drawn by someone who had finally stopped walking in circles. David had mistaken her silence for surrender because that was how he had always interpreted her strength, by pretending it was softness. But the woman stepping through the courthouse doors now was not trying to prove him wrong with noise. She was building a life he would no longer be allowed to misread. Outside, the wind lifted a strand of hair across her cheek, and she tucked it back with a slow, deliberate motion. There was no audience for this moment. No applause, no dramatic confession waiting in the wings. Only the pale winter sun on the glass, the weight of her folder against her arm, and the quiet certainty that her future would not be negotiated in someone else's tone. Emma descended the courthouse steps one measured step at a time, head high, coat buttoned, gaze steady. Behind her, the building remained unchanged. Ahead of her, the street opened wide. And for the first time in years, she did not feel pursued. She felt free. The hearing had ended, but Emma did not feel victory in the usual way. There was no rush of triumph, no trembling relief, no sudden need to explain herself to anyone. She simply walked out of the courthouse with her folder pressed against her side, her steps even, her face calm, and her heart beating with a steadiness that had taken years to earn. The winter air outside was sharp enough to wake every thought she had spent too long trying to bury. It touched her cheeks, slipped beneath the collar of her coat, and reminded her that she was no longer standing in David's shadow. Behind her, the courthouse doors swung open and shut with a dull, heavy rhythm, but she did not look back. David had once believed that silence meant weakness in her. He had mistaken restraint for surrender, patience for fear, and dignity for something he could bend with enough pressure. That mistake had cost him more than he understood. In the corridor before she left, he had tried again to reclaim the room with that old, careless smile, the one he wore whenever he believed the world would protect him from consequences. But Emma had already learned something he never had. A person does not need to speak loudly to be impossible to ignore. Her attorney walked beside her for a few steps, speaking in a low voice about next steps, but Emma heard only fragments. Dates, filing, review, the language of unfinished battles, now delivered without panic. She nodded once, then paused at the front steps where pale sunlight spilled across the stone landing. A reflection caught in the glass doors behind her, and for one brief second she saw herself as someone else might have seen her now. Not the wife who had once swallowed every insult to keep a marriage standing, not the woman who had arrived in court carrying the weight of other people's assumptions, but someone composed, precise, and impossible to pull apart. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She did not need to look to know who it was from. David had always hated being unanswered. He believed attention was a right, not a privilege. Emma let the phone stay silent in her hand for 3 full breaths before she finally checked the screen. One message, then another, then a call she did not accept. She read none of them. She only locked the screen and slipped the phone away again. Across the street, traffic moved in a steady stream, tires hissing over damp pavement, people crossing with their collars turned up against the cold. Life was continuing in every direction, and for once, she was not begging for a place inside someone else's version of it. She stepped off the courthouse stairs and joined the sidewalk with a quiet, unhurried grace. Her coat moved softly around her legs. Her folder remained under her arm, its edges marked by green tabs and notes she had prepared with care, not anger. That difference mattered. Anger burned fast. Care lasted. She had spent years being told she was too emotional, too soft, too willing to believe in promises that never held. Now she understood the real truth. She had not been weak. She had simply been loving someone who mistook kindness for surrender. A gust of wind swept past, lifting a strand of hair across her mouth. Emma tucked it back behind her ear and kept walking. No one on that street knew what she had survived. No one needed to. The future she was building did not require an audience. It required discipline, patience, and the kind of inner stillness that could survive being misunderstood. And somewhere behind her, in a building full of polished floors and cold fluorescent light, David was still trying to make sense of a woman he had lost the right to define. But Emma was already several blocks away by then, moving toward a life that would not ask permission to begin. Emma did not go home after the hearing. She walked instead, letting the cold afternoon air cut through the heat still lingering under her skin. The city moved around her in sharp little fragments, taxi lights flashing on wet pavement, office workers hurrying past with coffee cups clenched in gloved hands, a woman in a camel coat laughing into her phone beside a storefront window. Everything looked ordinary. That was the strange part. Her life had cracked open in a room full of fluorescent light and legal language. Yet the world outside kept spinning as if nothing had happened. She adjusted the strap of her bag and kept her eyes forward. In her hand was the folder she had carried out of the courthouse, thick with tabs, notes, and copies she had made herself at a copy shop 3 blocks away from her apartment. It was not elegant. It was not glamorous. It was simply ready. For years, she had been told she was difficult when she asked questions, paranoid when she saved receipts, disrespectful when she wanted things in writing. So she had learned to keep her own record, quietly and carefully, long before David ever realized she was paying attention. That habit had saved her more than once. It had saved her now. By the time she reached her building, the sky had already dimmed into the soft gray blue of early evening. She climbed the stairs slowly, not because she was tired, but because she was thinking. Her apartment felt different when she unlocked the door. Smaller, yes, but also hers in a way it had not felt when David still used to walk through it, as if he had every right to decide what belonged where. The room was warm. A lamp near the window cast a pale amber glow over the table where she had spread out her papers earlier that morning. She set the folder down beside a ceramic mug gone cold and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. It did not feel empty. It felt earned. Emma removed her coat, hung it neatly by the door, and rolled up the sleeves of her sweater. Then she opened her laptop and checked the email she had received 2 hours before the hearing. It was from a legal assistant at a firm across town, confirming a consultation for the following week. Not a dramatic message, not a grand promise, just a quiet door opening. She read it twice anyway, not because she doubted it, but because she was still learning how to trust calm things. On the table beside the laptop sat a yellow legal pad filled with her handwriting. Questions, dates, times, names, small facts that had once been dismissed as trivial and now formed the backbone of everything she had built. She ran her finger down the page and stopped at one line she had underlined 3 times. Stay precise, stay steady, stay honest. David had always preferred emotion because emotion was easier to twist. Facts, however, stayed put. Facts did not beg. Facts did not apologize for existing. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text from her sister lit the screen. You made it through. Are you okay? Emma looked at the message for a long moment before typing back. I am better than okay. It was not bravado. It was not a performance. It was a simple truth she was finally strong enough to say. She set the phone face down and walked to the kitchen, where she filled the kettle and watched water begin to tremble toward a boil. The sound was soft, almost private. Steam rose in a faint white ribbon, blurring the window over the sink. Outside, the last of the daylight touched the brick buildings across the street and turned their edges gold. Emma stood in that light and let the quiet settle into her bones. She was no longer the woman trying to explain herself to a man committed to misunderstanding her. She was the woman who had kept the receipts, kept the copies, kept her dignity intact even when no one was clapping for it. And that kind of strength did not need an audience. It only needed time. In the weeks that followed, she would meet with people who spoke in careful sentences and slid folders across polished tables. She would ask better questions. She would sleep more deeply. She would begin making plans that were entirely her own. But tonight, there was only this room, this silence, this small life she was rebuilding with her own hands. Emma carried her mug to the window, rested one shoulder against the frame, and looked out at the city lights coming alive one by one. Somewhere beyond them, David was still trying to turn her into a story that made him comfortable. He would not succeed. Not anymore. She took a slow breath, steady and sure, and let the cold glass cool her fingertips. The future did not arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrived as a quiet apartment, a working lamp, a folder full of proof, and a woman finally willing to trust her own judgment. Emma closed her eyes for one brief second, then opened them again. She was not waiting to be rescued. She was already becoming free. The first hint that Emma was no longer the woman David could corner came on a Thursday morning, when she received a plain white envelope with no return address and a heavy cream card inside. The invitation was simple, almost severe, a private legal symposium downtown, held in one of those glass towers that reflected the sky, so cleanly it made the whole city look sharpened. Emma stood in her quiet apartment with the envelope in one hand and a mug of coffee cooling in the other, reading the name at the bottom twice before her breathing changed. The event had not been sent to impress her. It had been sent because someone had noticed her. That was a different kind of power. She set the invitation beside the folders still spread across her kitchen table, next to the tabbed copies of bank records, property filings, and the careful notes she had spent nights organizing under the yellow light of her lamp. Her life had become a series of deliberate details. Fresh ink, clean margins, enough sleep to think clearly, enough distance to hear her own instincts again. By the time she stepped into the shower and let the hot water hit her shoulders, she had already made a decision. She would go. Not for him. Not for the past. For the woman she was becoming. The morning of the symposium arrived with a hard, bright sky and a wind that tugged at the hem of her coat as she walked toward the building. Inside, the lobby gleamed with polished stone and quiet wealth. Men in tailored suits spoke in low voices near the elevator banks. Women in silk blouses moved with the calm precision of people who knew exactly where they were going. Emma did not hurry. She crossed the marble floor at an even pace, her heels making a soft, steady sound that seemed to belong to someone else now, someone less haunted. In the mirrored wall near the reception desk, she caught a glimpse of herself and almost did not recognize the woman looking back. There was no softness left in the way she held her shoulders, no hesitation in the line of her mouth. Only composure. A receptionist checked her name, smiled politely, and handed her a badge. She clipped it to her coat and followed the current of attendees toward the elevator. On the 32nd floor, the conference room was all glass and filtered light, with long tables, bottled water, and folders arranged in perfect rows. Emma chose a seat near the middle, where she could see the room without feeling watched. She was opening her notebook when a familiar voice drifted across the space, smooth and amused, carrying the kind of confidence that had once made her mistake volume for strength. David had arrived early, as if the room still belonged to him. He wore a dark suit that fit too well and a smile that did not reach his eyes. Beside him stood his new girlfriend, polished and smiling for the room in the way people often did when they wanted to be seen with the right man. David noticed Emma a moment later. His expression shifted, only slightly, but she saw it. Surprise first, then something sharper, then the old, ugly certainty that she still occupied the same place she had once been forced to stand. He walked over with his hands relaxed at his sides, as though this were casual, as though he had not spent months speaking about her, as if she were a cautionary tale. "I did not expect you to be invited," he said, his tone light enough to pretend it was a compliment. Emma looked up from her notes slowly. "And yet, here I am," she said. The words were quiet, almost gentle. That was what unsettled him. He glanced at the folders in front of her, then at the badge on her coat, as if searching for the weak point he used to know by heart. But Emma had stopped offering him access to her nerves. Around them, the room was filling with low conversation, the soft clink of glass, the rustle of paper, the subtle attention that comes when two people with history stand too close in public. David smiled again, but the smile had thinned. "Still preparing like everything is a courtroom?" he asked. Emma closed her notebook with one hand. "Only when it needs to be." For a beat, neither of them moved. It was a small exchange, almost nothing on the surface, but it landed with the clean certainty of a locked door. He had expected embarrassment. He had expected the old hesitation, the look away, the quiet compliance he once mistook for weakness. Instead, she was calm, measured, present. As the moderator called everyone to their seats, David returned to his place with a face that had gone carefully blank. Emma watched him go without triumph, without a smile. She only lowered her eyes to the first page of her notes and wrote one line beneath the date, steady as a heartbeat. Facts do not bend for anyone. The symposium was supposed to be about procedure, precedent, and the careful language of modern law, but Emma could feel the room tilting the moment she stepped inside. The glass tower downtown caught the afternoon sun and scattered it across polished tables, silver pitchers, and rows of neat black folders. People spoke in low voices with practiced smiles, the kind that never quite reached their eyes. Emma found her seat without rushing. Her beige coat was still buttoned. Her notebook was already open. She had learned that calm could be louder than anger when the right people were watching. Across the room, David noticed her almost at once. Of course he did. He had always been quick to recognize a scene when he thought he could control it. He came over with that same polished confidence she once mistook for strength, a conference badge swinging from his jacket, his tie perfectly centered, his expression arranged into something almost friendly. "You came alone," he said, as if that were the point. Emma looked up from her notes. "I came prepared." He let out a small, dry laugh, glancing at the pages in front of her as though paper could still be mistaken for fear. "You always did like your little systems," he said. "Tabs, highlights, color coding. It probably makes you feel safer." Emma did not answer right away. She simply turned one page, then another, the soft sound barely audible above the room's murmur. Her silence unsettled him more than a sharp reply would have. That much was clear in the way his smile tightened at the edges. The moderator began the session with a polished introduction, and the first speaker took the podium, but Emma was only half listening. She was waiting for the moment she knew was coming. Not because she feared it anymore, because she had finally stopped pretending it would never arrive. When the discussion shifted toward document integrity and legal strategy, David leaned back in his chair and crossed one ankle over the other, looking for all the world like a man certain the room belonged to him. Then he spoke, casually enough to sound harmless. "People always act stronger after they have been broken once," he said, his eyes moving briefly to Emma. "Sometimes they confuse a neat presentation with real power." A few people shifted in their seats. A few others smiled politely, unsure whether they were supposed to laugh. Emma lifted her gaze and met his without blinking. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and even. And some people confuse volume with authority. The line landed cleanly. No one laughed. No one moved. The air seemed to thicken around the table. David held her stare for a second too long, then looked away first. It was a tiny defeat, the kind only the people closest to the fire would have noticed, but Emma felt it. Not as triumph. As proof. Proof that he no longer knew how to speak to the woman she had become. During the break, attendees drifted toward the coffee station in clusters of 2 and 3, carrying ceramic cups and folded agendas. Emma remained where she was, taking a slow sip of water while the city glimmered behind the glass wall. Her phone vibrated once. A message from Daniel. "I am downstairs. No pressure. Just here if you want me." She read it once, then set the phone face down beside her notebook. A few minutes later, the room shifted again as Daniel entered the lobby beneath the symposium hall. He did not enter like a man trying to be seen. He entered like someone who knew exactly who he was, and did not need the room to announce it for him. Tailored navy suit. No excess. No performance. Yet people still turned. They always did around men who carried quiet authority without reaching for it. When Emma saw him, something in her shoulders softened almost imperceptibly. Not because she needed saving. Because for the first time, she did not have to stand alone in a room that had once taught her how to shrink. Daniel reached her table and placed a single hand on the back of her chair, brief and steady, a gesture so simple it almost disappeared. Then he looked at the open notebook, the scattered notes, the underlined facts, and smiled in a way that was more reassurance than pride. "You are ready," he said. Emma closed the notebook with measured calm. "I have been ready for a while." Behind them, the room continued its polite hum, but a few nearby conversations had already thinned. People were noticing the change in the air. David, returning from the coffee station with a paper cup in hand, stopped when he saw Daniel. His expression did not collapse. It tightened, then went still, like a door quietly locking. Emma did not look at him. She only stood, gathered her folder, and turned slightly toward Daniel as he offered his arm. Nothing dramatic. Nothing loud. Just a choice made in full view of the people who had once mistaken her restraint for weakness. David watched as she accepted that arm and walked with Daniel toward the main hall, each step steady, unhurried, certain. The symposium doors opened ahead of them, and the light from inside spilled across the polished floor like a line being drawn in permanent ink. Emma crossed it without hesitation. The first time David tried to speak to her after the symposium, Emma did not even turn her head. She was standing beside a long table of glass water pitchers and neatly stacked programs. One hand resting lightly on the edge of her folder, the other wrapped around a paper cup of black coffee that had already gone lukewarm. Around them, the hotel ballroom had begun to soften into the slow movement of evening, the chandeliers glowing above polished floors, voices rising and falling in careful, expensive tones. David stepped into her line of sight anyway, as if proximity alone still gave him authority. He wore the same confident expression he had always used when he wanted the room to believe him. But this time, there was something frayed beneath it, something unfinished. "You left before I could answer your questions," he said, keeping his voice low enough to sound controlled. Emma looked at him at last, not with anger, not with pleading, but with the quiet patience of someone who had already stopped needing permission to leave a conversation. "I did not ask for your answer," she said. The words were soft, almost polite, and that made them land harder than any raised voice could have. David blinked once, then let out a thin breath through his nose, the kind of exhale that suggested he still thought this was a temporary mood, something he could wait out. He glanced toward Daniel, who was speaking with two attorneys near the edge of the room, then back at Emma. "You think standing next to him changes what happened," he said. "You think this is some kind of victory." Emma lowered her coffee cup and set it down with careful precision. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. "No," she replied. "I think it is the first time I have seen you clearly." For a brief moment, his expression tightened in a way the old David would have hidden better. Not enough for the room to notice. Enough for her to recognize. The gala lighting softened the edges of everyone else, but not his face. Not the strain behind his mouth. Not the faint crease between his brows. As if he had walked into a version of her life he had not prepared to lose. Behind them, a burst of laughter rippled from another table, then faded into the background hum of silverware and low conversation. Emma reached into her folder and withdrew a single page, not with drama, but with the same calm she used when organizing evidence. She did not hand it to him right away. She let him see the tab at the top first, the one marked in blue. "This," she said, "is a copy of the timeline your team submitted." David's eyes dropped to the paper. Just for a second, the air changed. "And this," Emma continued, tapping another page beneath it, "is the document that shows where it does not match the record." He did not take the page. He did not speak. The silence between them had weight now, a dense and expensive thing, as if everyone nearby had become aware without fully understanding why. Emma could feel it, that subtle shift in the room, the way people sense a storm before the first drop falls. But she did not rush to fill the silence. She had learned that silence, when used correctly, could do more work than any speech. Daniel returned then, stopping beside her with an easy steadiness that seemed to calm the space around him. He did not interrupt. He only looked at the page in her hand, then at her face, and gave the smallest nod, as if to say the moment belonged to her. David saw that too. It was in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his eyes moved back and forth between them, searching for leverage and finding none. He had expected uncertainty, hesitation, maybe even fear. Instead, he found a woman who no longer flinched when he entered the room. Emma slipped the page back into her folder. "The hearing is over," she said, "but the record is not." Then she picked up her coffee, turned slightly toward Daniel, and began to walk. Not quickly, not to escape, simply forward. The evening had settled over the hotel like polished glass, quiet and expensive, reflecting the last pale traces of daylight across the ballroom windows. Emma stood near the long table of water pitchers and folded programs, the black coffee in her hand gone lukewarm long ago, untouched except for the slow circle her thumb made around the paper cup. The room around her was full of low voices and careful smiles, the kind people wore when they were waiting to see whether old wounds would bleed again. David was there too, of course. He had positioned himself where he could be seen, jacket perfect, expression arranged into that practiced look of concern he had always mistaken for authority. But Emma no longer measured him the way she once had. He was simply part of the noise now, one more man in a room full of polished shoes and borrowed certainty. Daniel stood beside her with quiet ease, one hand resting near his pocket, the other holding nothing at all, as if he needed no performance to occupy space. He did not crowd her. He did not speak for her. He only waited, steady and unhurried, the way a person stands when he trusts the truth to arrive on its own. David noticed that trust and hated it immediately. Emma could see it in the tightening of his mouth, in the quick flick of his eyes toward Daniel, then back to her folder, as if he were searching for a weakness he could name. He found none. Instead, he found her calm. That seemed to unsettle him more than any accusation ever could. When the moderator called the room to order, the sound of chairs shifting softened into a hush that moved through the ballroom in waves. The overhead chandeliers glowed against the mirrored walls, scattering light over crystal glasses and white linen, turning the whole space into something almost ceremonial. Emma opened her folder and removed the copy of the settlement agreement she had marked days earlier with blue tabs at every critical page. No trembling hands, no dramatic pause, just a clean, deliberate motion, the kind of movement that comes from someone who has already made peace with being misunderstood. David let out a small, humorless breath. "You really came prepared," he said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Emma did not lift her head right away. She let the silence stretch until it belonged to her. Then she looked at him, not with anger, but with the kind of steady attention that leaves no room for guessing. "I came informed," she said. The words were quiet, but they landed hard in the space between them. A few people turned. Someone at the back stopped mid-whisper. David tried to smile, but it did not reach his eyes. "This is still about the past to you, is it not?" he asked, leaning slightly forward, as if proximity could restore control. Emma turned one page in her folder. The paper made a soft sound, almost lost beneath the chandeliers and murmuring crowd. "No," she said. "It is about the record." Daniel glanced down at the document, then at her face, and the smallest shadow of approval moved across his expression. Not because she needed rescuing, because she no longer needed permission. Across the room, David shifted his weight, suddenly aware that the room was not leaning in his direction anymore. Emma could feel the change. It was subtle, but unmistakable, the same way one can feel rain before it touches the ground. He had expected embarrassment, maybe hesitation, perhaps the old reflex to shrink. Instead, she sat at the edge of his reach like a woman who had finally learned where her own boundaries began. When the clerk asked for the next exhibit, Emma slid the highlighted copy forward with 2 fingers and said, "This is the version that was never shown to the court." No embellishment, no flourish, just fact after fact, placed carefully into the center of the room. David's face changed then, not all at once, but in small fractures. His confidence thinned. His jaw stiffened. His eyes moved too quickly, as if he were trying to outrun what was already on the page. Emma watched him try and fail to recover himself, and for the first time, she felt no urge to explain. The truth did not need decoration. It only needed light. By the time the hearing ended, the room had gone so quiet that even the soft scrape of paper sounded loud. Emma remained seated for 1 beat longer, her hands folded over the folder in her lap, her posture calm in a way that made the people around her uneasy. Across the table, David looked smaller than he had all morning. Not broken, not dramatic, just reduced to what he had always been when stripped of an audience. A man with too much confidence and too little patience for the truth. The judge had asked for one final clarification, and Emma had answered without ornament, without apology, with the same measured precision she had used all day. That was the moment the room changed. Not because she raised her voice, because she did not need to. When the clerk began collecting the exhibits, David reached for his glass and then stopped, his fingers hovering over the rim as if he had forgotten what to do with his own hands. Emma noticed, but she did not give him the mercy of attention. She slid 1 page back into place, then another, aligning the corners until the stack was perfectly square. A small habit, a quiet one, the kind that made order out of chaos, and let her breathe where she once would have felt herself fray. Daniel stood beside her chair, not crowding her, only present, as steady as the polished wood beneath the table. When Emma finally rose, the movement was unhurried, almost graceful, as if she were stepping out of a life she no longer needed to explain. David tried to say her name. It came out thin, uncertain, and she did not turn. He tried again, louder this time, but the sound landed in the room and seemed to lose its shape before it reached her. Emma gathered her folder, tucked it beneath one arm, and looked past him toward the corridor where sunlight was spilling in through a row of tall windows. The light touched the marble floor in long gold bands, and for a moment it seemed to hold her there, framing her in stillness. Then she walked forward, not fast, not fleeing, simply choosing the next step. Behind her, chairs shifted, a few low voices resumed, and the life of the room moved on around the empty space she had left behind. David remained where he was, staring after her as if the distance between them had become something he could measure too late. But Emma did not carry him with her. She carried only what she had earned: her name, her proof, her peace. Outside the courtroom doors, the air was cooler, touched with the faint scent of rain and city stone. Emma paused once at the top of the steps, not because she was uncertain, but because the world suddenly felt larger than the narrow version she had survived. Daniel came to stand beside her, and when he did, she let her shoulders relax for the first time all morning. The silence between them was not empty. It was spacious, clean, enough. Emma looked out at the street, at the moving cars, at the people hurrying toward lives that no longer concerned her, and she felt something settle deep in her chest, something calm and final. She had not needed to beg for fairness. She had not needed to perform her pain. She had simply stayed standing until the truth found its shape. And in the end, that was enough.